Hello and welcome to our coverage from the World Economic Forum. I'm Markus Karlsson in Davos. We're talking about climate change. Is it still on the global agenda? Leaders from business, politics and civil society are meeting here in Switzerland to discuss the challenges that face our world. And according to the World Economic Forum itself, climate change is one of those challenges. To talk more about that, I'm joined here in the studio by Andrew Steer. He's the head of the World Resources Institute, a non-profit organization based in the United States. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Now, are climate change issues high up on the agenda here in Davos this year?
Well, they are, yes. Each year before Davos begins, 1,000 opinion makers are surveyed and asked to rank 50 risks. Climate change came within the top 3. So unlike the last 3 or 4 years when economic crisis has sort of dominated thinking here, the first time as we're sort of heading out of crisis now, the world, at least the non-Western world, is really growing rapidly. Africa's doing well. We're now able to turn to longer term issues, and climate change is very central to that.
So it is taking enough room here in Davos?
Well, I mean, let's wait and see what comes out of it. But certainly there's a lot of sessions, some very senior people are starting to grapple with it. And the reason is pretty obvious. I mean, in the last year, we've had yet another whole set of extreme weather events. Take the United States, for example. I mean, the hottest year in history. The current drought that's going on in the United States will cost America 1% of its GDP. That will make it the most expensive natural disaster in the history of the United States. And then, of course, we have Hurricane Sandy, and look around the world, and you're starting to see real impacts. I mean, already in parts of Africa, you're seeing yields under threat. And obviously, around the world, cities that are highly vulnerable based on the coast are already starting to see sea level rise, storm surges. So mayors of cities, local government leaders, and especially private sector leaders are saying, look, we want to invest for the longer term. We need to know what the longer term is going to look like.
You speak there about investment. Renewable energy investment fell, though, in 2012, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Isn't that a rather discouraging sign?
Well, for the last 8 years, it's been rising very rapidly. It's now 6 times what it was. This last year, it was just over $250 billion. That's $250 billion. Now, it did decline, in part because some of the stimulus measures in the Western countries were starting to taper down, and also some of the incentives were taken away. And so countries that invested very heavily, in countries like Spain, investment dried up. In the developing world, you're still seeing about half of all the investment in renewable energy is coming from the China's, India's, Brazil's, Mexico's, and a whole range of developing countries. So yeah, it was disappointing that it fell, but on the other hand, it's still very much higher than it was. It's nowhere near enough. I mean, if we could get 3 times the current level, we'd really be starting to think about turning the corner.
Now, the Green Growth Alliance, which is a group backed by the World Economic Forum, says that around $14 trillion worth of investment will be needed in low-carbon industry and infrastructure by 2013 in order to meet the United Nations targets when it comes to climate change. Where is that money going to come from?
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things is this Green Growth Action Alliance, which is a very sort of buzzy and energetic, private sector-led sort of organization. It is the private sector that's now pushing governments. This came out of what was called the B20 last year. That's the business version of the G20. Coming out of that was this alliance of private sector, again now led by ex-President Calderon, and they are pushing for real reforms. And one of the things they're pushing for example, is the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies, which amount to over $500 billion a year.
But does that mean that business leaders are ready to pay up?
Well, it depends on the business leaders, but certainly there are some leaders that absolutely are saying, look, this is crazy, the situation right now. We know, we can see the writings on the wall that down the road, the entire world is going to recognize climate change as a problem. So we're going to have to put a price on carbon. better that we do it now. Why? Because we're going to make big investment decisions now. We don't want to see them stranded 4, 5, 6, 10 years from now. So we want the long-term regulatory and pricing framework to put in place today. So it doesn't necessarily mean that taxes have to rise. What would be smart is to tax bad things like greenhouse gas emissions and not tax good things like income and profits and work. So for the last 100 years, we've really been taxing things that are good, and we ought to be taxing things that are bad. And so the private sector, many of them are saying, look, let's start getting serious about this. And so
but you say that the private sector, they're starting to understand the current state of affairs. Why then aren't we seeing the kind of global action that so many people have been asking for quite some years now?
Well, look, there are huge vested interests still in the way we do business. And those who are doing well from the current way of doing business are putting very large resources into making sure that people believe that adopting a green path will kill jobs. And so we're seeing all kinds of exaggerations about if we put tougher measures in place on climate change, that will lead to higher costs, that will lead to lower investments, that will lead to lower jobs. Now it turns out the analysis suggests that's not true. Costs to start with are very modest, and it doesn't take very long at all before the growth path that you enjoy under a green policy framework is actually more rapid and is obviously altogether better for citizens. However, we haven't succeeded in making that case. Now each year that passes, it's easier to make that case because the impacts of climate change are becoming more evident, and also because the costs, for example, of renewable energy are declining, so that, for example, wind is now clearly at parity in most parts of the world with coal.
We're currently going through an energy revolution. I suppose it's fair to say that when it comes to shale oil and shale gas, they're currently becoming a lot more readily available across the world. It is forecast, for instance, that the United States will become the world's top oil producer in 2020. How does that influence the climate change debate?
Well, in a rather complex way. The shale gas revolution is obviously extremely good news for the economy. It's driven down prices of gas dramatically, and that is actually very good for the economy. It's also good in the sense that roughly half as much carbon comes per unit of energy from gas as from coal. So that's all good. And so it can be a very useful bridging mechanism.
But
the
gas,
problem
of course, is still not a clean energy, is it, from a carbon dioxide perspective?
That's the point, is that lowering things from 100 to 50 is good, but it's not enough. We need to lower total greenhouse gas emissions by between 80 and 90% in the West. And so it's not enough simply to adopt gas. But it is nonetheless a very valuable bridging mechanism. There's another problem associated with it, which is still being researched, which is methane emissions. And if methane emissions are more than about 3%, then what you find is the total greenhouse gas emissions from shale gas are higher than from coal, because methane is so damaging to the upper environment.
A lot of people are saying that the United States is just going to have to take the lead when it comes to climate change, seeing that the United States is now eyeing energy independence. Isn't there a risk that the climate change issue could become completely overshadowed in Washington, D.C.?
Well, very encouraging that in his inaugural address this week, President Obama laid out climate change as clearly as can be as a priority for his second administration, and he said, you know, we would simply be abandoning our children and our children's children if we don't pay attention to this. So within the president's power, even if he doesn't get congressional support, there are all kinds of things he can do in order to achieve the stated goal in the United States, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 17% by 2020 over 2005. But certainly, I mean, this is a huge lift for the United States to move from its current position to the kind of position which we need them to play, which is in a leadership role. Now, to their credit, the United States in the last year has closed 55 coal-powered electricity generating plants. Now, as a result, its exports of coal have soared. And so American coal is now fueling plants in other parts of the world. So not clear that's a good thing. But there's some evidence that things are heading in the right direction there. But look, we need leadership all round if we're going to get the global deal on climate by 2015 that the world has committed to.
What about China? Could we see Chinese leadership or more proactive Chinese leadership?
Yes, we could. But you know, the existing 12th five-year plan is fairly ambitious. China is committed to lower its carbon intensity of GDP by 41% by 2020. That's an impressive lift. China is investing about $50 billion per year in renewable energy and actually doing some very interesting innovations with regard to financing energy efficiency. The problem still is that the demand for energy is such that they are still having to build hundreds of coal-fired power stations. We just did, World Resource Institute just did a report which we brought out a couple of weeks ago, which looked at all of the planned coal plants over the coming years, and 1,200 power plants, 75% of them in China and India. So yes, it's a problem, but look, this year China is for the first time going to be implementing a cap and trade system that will, on 5 cities, 2 provinces, put limits on their greenhouse gas emissions, and those will be traded within the city, and by 2015 there will be a nationwide system. So, you know, there is action going on, but you know, what we need to see in the next couple of years is countries, you know, raising the game on each other. We need the United States, Europe, United and China really to together show leadership where we could get to where we need to get to.
All right, we're going to have to wait and see. Andrew Steer from the World Resources Institute, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. And with that, we're going to wrap up the program. Thanks for watching, False Bank Guest.